Well, I'll jump right in if that's okay with you.
No, no problem.
Okay. Well, I'd be curious to know just right before we even really get into it, what did your journey into scholarship look like? And could I ask maybe specifically, how did you end up in the cultural engagement kind of realm? I know like you'd be director of cultural engagement at Dallas.
Well, at the Hendricks Center at the seminary, yes.
Okay, at the Hendricks Center.
Yeah. Basically, I see it as a natural extension of what it means to have spent my career in New Testament, particularly with reference to Jesus and the Gospels and Acts. Most of my teaching has been in those areas. And, with the ethical thrust that comes out of Jesus's teaching, the emphasis in thinking through how people are to function in the world in which God has them, et cetera. It's a natural extension of not just talking about the text, but actually thinking through the application of the text.
Was that early on for you? I mean, when you were just starting to think about
I've always had those interests, but I would
Okay.
say as the culture shifted and becoming a Christian moved out of a predominantly dominant Christian environment, or at least Christian ethos, into a non-Christian environment and a much more secularized environment, the need for the church to be able to function in light of that shift and the additional demands that were put on it, I think moved me in that direction. The catalyst events were in the 90s when I started to see specials coming across on Jesus on national television that were a reflection more of skepticism than embracing of the New Testament. I thought, man, there's got to be a way to articulate this and to represent it. And then in thinking through the larger questions about all the things that the Gospels in particularly touch on, it became clear, I think, that that area became important in thinking through how's the church supposed to function in the midst of this kind of pluralism that we now find ourselves in, became a pressing question. And most academic pursuits, at least in biblical studies, don't go there naturally. Most theological curriculums that you look at don't have courses as a given that are required, say, on the area of ethics and that kind of thing. So it just seemed like a natural move.
Even that, though, is interesting that you think about the church in your scholarship, because I don't find that is in the guys that I talk to and interact with, not being in the world. It doesn't always seem like that's the case. Like these can be kind of two silos, like scholarship over here, church over here. But you've seen like how as a scholar you can speak into the church.
Yeah, in fact, I sometimes argue that the academic side of theological studies has been driven by the university and the university model, which tends to be strictly academic. At one point portrayed itself as being particularly neutral, that kind of thing, or earlier in service of Christian beliefs. But that is not where what a seminary is supposed to be, for example, or even a Christian educational institution is supposed to have that Christian element or perspective that drives it. And so those questions, I think, have to be asked.
Yeah. Well, at the very beginning, when you were like, I don't know, when the career and scholarship was kind of starting to show itself that's the direction you were headed, did it already have a ministry bent? Was it a passion for, I just want to study the New Testament more than I have? Was it really wanting to be a scholar?
I started off in technical New Testament studies and was trying to think hermeneutically how the Bible fit together, dealing with some of the challenges that people had about the Bible, that kind of thing. And then I gradually moved into these areas as I was spending time in the Gospels. And the bulk of that time was in Luke Acts. And Luke Acts is the most ethically oriented of the Gospels. And then I was president of the Evangelical Theological Society for 1 year, right at the beginning of the century. And And so I had to do an address, and my address was on what I call purpose-driven theology. And the whole point was to say, the church needs a different kind of academic. And it was designed to step into these public spaces and to represent the church in the midst of the world, et cetera. What I didn't know at the time is I was actually writing a job description that I would take up a decade later. But to me, I was making the case, this is the natural progression of what a Christian scholar should be. And so, it was, at that time I was doing standard New Testament things in the New Testament department, wasn't thinking about this kind of a role. But then as I thought through what I was saying and where I was going and where it was taking me, then it ended up being a very natural transition. And I ended up doing some of the things I was talking about doing.
Well, I got to say, I mean, we're going through the book of Acts right now in our church, and your Acts commentary is I mean, week to week, just the most helpful, because you still function as a technical commentary, but just the pastoral insights that are helpful to me there, compared to, in other commentaries, I seem to find a technical commentary or a pastoral commentary without any technical or
Connection
too much
between the two.
Yeah. But you seem to have
we're
landed
trying to connect dots.
Yeah. So I've
Connect
benefited
dots.
greatly
I mean,
from
it's
that.
to connect the content of the text with where life has us. Life
Yeah.
is a challenge because we live in a dysfunctional world. We don't live in an ideal world.
Yeah.
So how do you function in the midst of that chaos?
Yep. So, and I could just look on the front of the book, but that was the Acts commentary. Was that pretty early on? In hearing
No,
you
that was
talk about your Luke Acts.
I'd spent 14 years working on the Luke commentary. The Acts
Oh,
commentary
okay.
took about 4.
Okay.
And it came after, and it was much later. And I was already kind of in this space
Okay.
by the time Acts came along.
Okay. Well, with regards to cultural engagement, then, and thinking about your book, Cultural Intelligence, could you just define for me cultural intelligence and maybe why it is so important right now?
Well, it's particularly important because one thing I tell people is, if you ask the question, what does the culture say? You've already missed what is going on, because we don't live in a culture. We live in cultures, plural. Sure. And they rub against each other. And my analogy is they're like plate tectonics, they're like fault lines. And so they rub against each other. Sometimes pressure builds up and you get, an explosion, you get an earthquake. And so cultural intelligence is the ability to read all that these cultures in their mix are delivering to you, and to have some sense about how to function, particularly as a Christian, in the midst of that. So the subtitle of the book, of course, is basically how to live in a pluralistic world, and as a Christian, how to live for God in a pluralistic world. And so there's an awareness of what the church is supposed to be. There's an awareness of the variety of things that are going on around you in dealing with that. And I sometimes say, when you think about culture, it's a little bit like a Middle Eastern bazaar, lots of booze, lots of things being sold, et cetera. And some of those booze are pretty bizarre. There are unusual things that are going on, being said, perspectives being taken, et cetera. So how do you interact with that? Cultural intelligence is the ability to try and read and react and biblically to what's going on culturally. And I have in mind not just being able to assess what's going on, but to know what tone of conversation to bring to those spaces where the world is challenging the church. I can't expect the world to live like the church. That's why you need the church. So, I can't expect people who are not Christian, haven't experienced the grace of God, haven't experienced the presence of the Spirit, to live like people who have those benefits. And so I've got to create the right kinds of expectations. And the church is designed to be a place of invitation in the midst of a world that's got all kinds of things going on in it.
Sure.
And so it's cultural intelligence is the ability to skillfully apply and deal with that tension between where people are as believers and where the world is.
Do you think it's in writing that book, are you thinking that it is especially important now compared to other times in our
It's
history?
always important. It's become more important now because as the culture had a, the way I describe it, we used to have a Judeo-Christian net around the culture that we live in, at least in the West. We had a Judeo-Christian net around us. It didn't mean that everyone was a Christian, but Christian values were appreciated and for the most part embraced. We've lost that net. So now the challenge is, how do you live in the midst of not having that net? And how do you function in the midst of not having that net? And how do you function in a context where before you might have been affirmed, now you're getting pushback? Another illustration I use is, we've gone from, in my lifetime, we've gone from being the home team to being the visiting team, only we're not just the visiting team, we're the rivals. We're getting booed on the court. So that shift requires a different kind of approach and strategy and mental makeup, really, to what you're facing.
As someone who lived through that change, were you surprised at how fast that happened?
Not entirely. I actually went overseas to Europe as a doctoral student in the late 70s, thinking to myself, here, I see what's happening in the United States in the direction that we're going. Europe's probably 20 years ahead of us. So I want to go and live in some Christian context in which Christianity is not in the middle of the culture, and try and think through and figure out what that's like, because I think that's coming. And of course, what happened was that 20-year gap has shrunk down now to, in some cases, being no gap at all or very little gap. And on some things, we're ahead of other people in terms of where they are in the way we've secularized. So I very much sense that was coming. That was actually part of my justification for getting doing my doctoral work in Scotland.
Oh, interesting. Placing yourself there so that you could
I could see how the church needed to function in that kind of environment.
Okay.
One, understand it, and then two, think through what the function of the church should be in that kind of an environment.
And so again, I mean, you already said, but your mind, on the church and the cultural engagement was there right from the.
See, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I came to the Lord in college, and so I knew what it was. I'd say it this way: I knew what it was to think like a non-believer.
Sure.
I knew what values and what the drivers were, et cetera. So when I came to faith, that past experience, and then raising the question, how do I now as a believer talk to someone who is where I was 5 years ago? Yeah. Okay. And that was always a question, and been a question that's driven me in a lot of my work.
You think, I mean, being an unbeliever for so long gave you insight into unbelievers?
Just gave me
that
a
you wouldn't
different
have had?
kind of experience and a different kind of relating. I always had a sense about what I was. Once I came to faith, I always had a sense of, this is what I am assuming about what I believe that is not a given for the person I'm talking to.
Sure. Assuming that because that was you?
Because assuming that, because that comes with the Christian faith. I talk about this now. I said there are 4 issues that are wrapped up in sharing the gospel that a believer has that an unbeliever might not have. There are 4 issues, at least 4, and articulate them. They start with the very basics. First of all, does God exist? Okay, some people aren't even there. Second one is, does God speak? Okay, well, if God doesn't speak, the moment I say to them, the Bible says, or God says through his word says, that doesn't make any sense to them. They can't process that as a support for anything. Yeah. So that's a second assumption. Third assumption is the complete uniqueness of Jesus. The idea that the creator God could be incarnate and be human at the same time and express himself and show himself in the world that way. I mean, that's God says on steroids, if you will. And that's a completely unique, no other human being has had that combination. So that's a new category. And then the last category is, and that creator God, you're responsible to that creator God, whether you recognize it or not. All four of those ideas are wrapped up in an offer of the gospel. We don't talk about them generally very explicitly. We assume them.
Yeah.
But as you're interacting with an unbeliever, depending on where they are on the scale of those questions,
Yeah.
you're creating categories for them that they currently don't have.
Sure. Oh, I'm going to have to rewatch this and give that more thought. That's a helpful thing to think about. Kind of the presuppositions that you're coming into these
Presuppositions
with.
So they can even process what you're saying to them.
Yep.
I mean, the point I'm making is they don't even have the categories to process what it is that you're saying to them.
Sure.
And so when they say that doesn't make any sense, that's because they don't have the categories to have it make any sense. They haven't thought about the world in that way. So you're talking right past them.
I'm maybe spending too much time on this. I just find it so fascinating. When you're, in your general writing or your kind of most common disposition, are you writing to scholars or always church in mind?
I'm always writing with the church in mind.
Okay.
Only in my most technical works am I writing just to scholars. When
you write just to scholars,
they're the only ones who are going to be reading this.
When you write just to scholars, does that feel?
When I'm writing to scholars,
does that feel less important?
They're the only ones who are going to be reading what I'm writing. But when I'm writing in a general commentary mode or something like that, I'm trying to write for as many people as I can.
So in terms of what kind of gives you, I don't know, a life or purpose in these things, like when you're writing to scholars, does that feel a little less important, or is it just a different category?
No. It's a different kind of communication and with a very important audience.
Okay. You just live in such a different space than I think it's wonderful. It's a blessing to us in the church, for sure. Well, how do you think the Western Church is doing with cultural engagement?
Generally speaking, not well.
Okay.
I think we have forgotten that people are not the enemy; they're the goal.
Okay.
Unbelieving people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I shouldn't be surprised that someone's an unbeliever. We're all unbelievers at one point or another. Mm-hmm. I should never forget that when God tapped me on the shoulder, my back was turned to him. And so if I remember where I come from, that should set me up for a little more empathy as I interact with people who are coming from a different place. Or let me say it this way. If a person doesn't believe that they're made in God's image, okay, which is obviously what the Christian church teaches and what gives value to the human being. If they don't believe that, then their only alternative is to determine their own identity and to make their own choices. So the fact that the world goes there is the automatic default that shouldn't surprise us.
Sure.
That's where you go when you don't understand why you're here. Mm-hmm. So, and then the question is, all right, how do I get in the business of creating categories that the person currently doesn't have? How do I do that empathetically? How do I do that with some sense of engagement about what might be driving them to form the identity that the way they are, et cetera? So I'm much more concerned about understanding where the other person is and why they're there and what is driving them in that space than I am about necessarily my own agenda with them.
Sure. With that in mind, do you think our Christian culture right now can be far too easily offended by culture?
It's far too easily offended by culture. It turns itself into the victim far too often because Jesus was very clear, you follow me, the world's going to push back. Don't be surprised. He spent the whole second half of his ministry teaching his disciples that was going to be the case. I think we're far too, we're fighting a battle and making people the enemy when the battle is a spiritual battle.
Sure.
And the spiritual forces at work incognito. So the other people that we're interacting with, who we're responding to, are reacting out of a place where they don't even realize what's going on.
Yeah. Even
with them.
Yeah.
So we may be aware of that, but they may not be. And so,
that's a good point.
So I'm trying to bring them into a conversation, a space that makes them think about who they are and why they're here, that kind of thing, and can make sense out of it all.
Yeah. In cultural intelligence, you talk a bit about building bridges. Can you think of any, I don't know, particular issues or spaces or categories where we're especially struggling to build bridges, or just in the whole thing?
Our general approach is one of confrontation.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that there isn't a challenge in the gospel. There absolutely is. I tell people the gospel is a message that has tension in it. Okay. There's a challenge. That's why you talk about sin and forgiveness and judgment, but there's also an invitation. There's a better way to live. If I only do the challenge part,
Yeah.
I've never shared what makes the gospel good news. And the gospel is called good news for a reason.
Yeah.
Okay, it's good news because you can reconnect to the living God. If I never get to that place and that space and the grace of God that generates that invitation, then I haven't shared the gospel. If all I'm doing is pointing out where the world is falling short and
Yeah.
don't share with the opportunity that it could be better,
Yeah.
and that there's another way, that kind of thing. And with the awareness that God deals with the sin problem through the forgiveness and atoning work, the loving act of Christ, and reflect that in the way I engage with people, then I'm selling short what makes the good news the good news.
Yeah. Yeah. I always, that's a good point. Working in young adult ministry for quite a while, I always felt like often the sales pitch was just, pointing out what you were doing wrong, uh, kind of just beating people down. Where I always felt, we kind of always talked about it and felt like nobody ever came to scripture. It came to Jesus because you told them that drinking beer was bad, or that's not much of a sales pitch if you never get to, if there's no grace. Uh, it always seemed like
If
those
there's
things
not on
should
the
come
other end an
after we've
indication that life
talked
can be
about the
better,
gospel. What's
that
that?
life can be, if there's never an indication on the other end that life can be better, it can be more
Yeah.
full. You can have a sense of location. I tell people theology is like real estate: location, location, location. If you don't have a sense of why you're here and
Yeah.
what you're here for and how to make sense of what's going on around you, um, then it's no wonder you're in an in-between world where you're
Yeah.
constantly searching. I say, if you will listen to people carefully who are searching, they will say things like, I'm trying to find myself.
Yeah.
My joke is, well, I thought you were here all along,
Mm.
but the whole point here is that there's something I don't understand why I'm here and why I'm doing what I'm doing. I don't understand what life is about. That's dislocating.
Yeah.
That's being suspended in midair.
Yep.
Gospel is about giving you location, making sense out of who you are and why you're here and what your connection points are, et cetera. It really solidifies how you see life.
A good picture of it. It's just confusing why why our knee-jerk reaction always seems to be to start with the legal or the moral, the ethical before the gospel. Anyways, well, I was going to ask this, and maybe this is too broad, but what would you say are some of the most significant cultural changes that you've seen that the church needs to understand and engage with
Main
better
one
than it
is that
currently is?
because people have this sense of dislocation, they don't know why they're here,
Mhm.
and they don't think there's any structure to the world and the life that they live in. Everyone's free to make their own choices. And then I have this picture. What's it like? What would it be like to, maybe you live this way? What would it be like to be on a freeway where there are no lanes and there are no rules? Pretty chaotic.
Yeah.
Actually pretty dangerous. So, it's the judge's picture of everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Pretty chaotic time.
Yeah.
And so what we try and do is, well, let everyone have their truth and have their space, but they're bumping into each other all the time.
Sure.
And so, it's just a very difficult place to live. Not surprising. It's the natural outcome of being there, but it is what we face. And the church is slow to engage people on why they are comfortable in that kind of a space.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So why, have they just given up and finding sense out of life, or are they searching or whatever? We because we're so committed to trying to tell people where they ought to be, we don't find out where they're actually located. So a lot of the book is about asking the right kinds of questions and engaging in the right kinds of conversations. And sometimes, rather than giving a response, we need to find out where people are, getting a spiritual GPS reading on someone. Where are they located and why? You want to understand their whys and wherefores for how they think about life. And initially, you want to put your theological meter on mute. Okay.
Yeah.
You aren't going to, I don't say do away with it. It's not going to go away. You're going to be thinking things about what you hear. But rather than responding out a rebuttal, that's why this is wrong, or let me tell you a different way, your first set of questions ought to be, so why do you think that way? What's going on? What's driving that, et cetera? You want to get a location on where they are and why. You want to understand where they're coming from. Then you're better equipped to know how to address them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Though I feel like, generally speaking, for some reason, the majority of us don't seem too interested in figuring out where people are.
Yeah, we just want to tell them where they ought to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is shifting gears a little, but what would be a biblical perspective, do you think, of what would be a biblical perspective of culture? Like and these are probably the two kind of poles that we are drawn to, and maybe there's a middle ground, but is it right to think we're at war with culture? I think you've already spoken to that a little, in that we're not at a battle. Or right to love and enjoy parts of culture? Is there a middle ground where it's not complete
it's a
assimilation and it's not complete rejection?
Where the world is the world is, generally speaking, antithetical to God. There is a battle that's going on. It's a spiritual battle. It's a battle for the souls and the location of people. So that's definitely going on. And that manifests itself in a variety of ways. And it's fed by all the vices, if I can say it that way, all the sins that drive us to be less than we ought to be, all those kinds of things. So it's definitely there. There's a battle. There's no doubt about it. But the question is, how do I gain someone who is, and I think the way the scripture pictures this is, people are entrapped. They're in the grips of an entrapment. They don't even know where it comes from.
Sure.
And so how do you gain someone who's entrapped? How do you indicate to them that doesn't have to be the default? Those kinds of questions. And you do it by contrast. The major way you do it is you do it by contrast. You live in a distinctive way. If you listen to the testimony of most people who come to the Lord who did not grow up in a Christian home, it will go somewhere. There will be this segment. It will be, I met this person, whoever it was. They were a Christian. They thought and did things differently, and I noticed, and it made me curious.
Yeah. So
on the one hand, you've got the world that is a challenge. Okay, if I could say it that way.
Sure.
And that Christian values collide against. No other way to say it. But on the other hand, I have a call that actually is supposed to be the distinctive indicator of being a Christian, which is my call to the great commandment. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. When the recognition is the neighbor isn't just the people who like me, but I'm actually called to love my enemy. And Jesus made a point out of this. What makes you distinctive is not your ability to love the person who loves you. What makes you distinctive is your ability to love your enemy.
Sure.
And so we're called to theoretically show that.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? That's the challenge.
Yeah, and that's the question. I mean, like, does that look like rejection of culture? Does that look like assimilation of culture? Or again, does that look like an ability, which I felt like was the Apostle Paul, to live in the culture, to reject and to find truth in pagan things. Sorry.
The picture in the book of Jeremiah is when Jews were called to live in Babylonian culture. And the Babylonian culture is not one of the most outstanding cultures ever created by man. They were told to serve the city. So, so you recognize what's going on around you, and you try to do your best to make it a better place and to live in such a way that it's a better place. That's what you're trying to do. I find it interesting. Daniel's kind of one of my heroes in this regard. You know, he served in the government. He was over, think about this for a second. He was over astrologers. That was his assignment. Now, what do you think he thought of astrology? Probably not too many positive thoughts, but he was responsible for administering them. How does that work?
Yeah.
And so, you know, and yet he lived distinctively, that when he was asked, how does he live personally and privately, the distinctives of his life became clear.
Sure. Yeah, that made sense. Well, kind of, I mean, similar to the assimilation rejection, do you think well, maybe starting with that, do you think there are particular questions that can be asked to find out where that line is, if there's a line where you're
Yeah, I think
too much of a friend of
this is
culture,
why the
too much of
Bible
an enemy
calls
of
us
culture?
to be wise. This is where wisdom comes in, is being able to make these kinds of judgments about where those lines are, et cetera. I mean, you're trying to do the best that you can to live as faithfully as you can in the midst of a world that isn't going in the direction that it should be going. And so, you know, at one level, the easiest way to do that is in terms of your own personal interaction and your own personal engagement and integrity. That's the baseline. The hard part comes when you're asked to move into spaces where those ways of living are skewed already.
Mm-hmm.
And those become judgment calls.
Sure.
And some of them aren't transparent as to what the call ought to be. And you just do the best you can to be as faithful as you can, and to be as faithful to your moral commitments as you can.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think when it comes to, you know, contextualization versus syncretism, we're often looking for a very, well, not even looking for, I think we often treat it like a very black and white. So that
Well, the
person is
problem is
definitely
that,
over the line, and that person's definitely in front of the line. But as you say, case by case, wisdom.
well, sometimes it's very hard to know. Some of the situations you find yourself in, both of the alternatives are poor.
Okay.
Okay. So, you know, I remember, I'll give you as an example, make it concrete. I remember a wife of a pastor, he come showing up at my office. She was taking my class at the time. And she walks in and she says, our daughter has come out as gay. She's engaged to be married. This is right after the Bergefell decision. She's engaged to be married to another woman. She knows her dad can't supervise over the wedding, but she's asked if he can read scripture at the wedding. What should we do? Okay. And I stopped and I said to her, you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody. It's either going to be with your daughter or it's going to be with the congregation. There was no way in that situation to have a simple and clean solution with everybody involved. Or another illustration, the same thing. A mother walks into a pastor's office and says, my child has come out and said he thinks he's gay. What should I do? The pastor has 5 different audiences that he has responsibility for, and the concerns of those 5 audiences are all very different. He has a responsibility to the child. He's in his congregation. He has a responsibility to parents in his child in his congregation. He has a responsibility to the congregation as a whole. He has a responsibility to the congregation as witness in the community. And he has a responsibility to God in Scripture. Those are not in alignment when that happens. Okay. So how do you manage that? All right. So there are going to be ethical judgments made with each one of those audiences in order to sort your way through that space in that situation. Sometimes a fallen world gives us alternatives, and none of them is very good.
Sure.
So what do you do then? That's the
Yeah.
problem. And you're trying to look for the answer that does, if I can say it this way, does the least damage.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, your first example, especially, that's a brilliant way to think about it. I mean, that's just the reality that, there's going to be a hard conversation with someone.
That's right. Yeah. And someone's going to need to understand where someone else is coming from.
Yeah. Well, maybe
And we're
that
not
leads,
good at that. We're too busy thinking about our own interests.
I mean, that answers maybe and already leads to my next question was going to be, why do you think it's so hard lately for people in our culture Christians especially, to engage in conversation with people who hold different perspectives?
Because we're interested in see the world from our own perspective. We're not interested enough in seeing where someone else is coming from and why. And what you're looking for in that conversation when you go there
Yeah.
is not that you agree, but you may stumble over a value that you share that person has applied in one way, and you can come along and say, you know what, I share that value, but this is how I apply it.
Yeah.
Okay. You're looking for something that you can share in your interactions that then allow the conversation to at least open up avenues for different prospects.
I mean, not so unlike Paul seeing the idol for unknown gods and being able to
that's what he
use
did in
that
Acts
as a
17. He walks in and he said, we know what he thinks about idolatry.
Yeah.
He doesn't like it. Okay.
Yeah.
We know in the passage before he gives a speech on Mars Hill, he saw the idols and says his spirit was provoked, which was a nice way of saying his blood pressure changed.
Yeah.
Okay. He wasn't happy. And yet he opens up by saying, I can see you're very religious in every respect.
Yeah.
I mean, what a way to open. And so his point is, I see you're interested in spiritual things. Okay. Underneath you think it may not be seeing the spiritual world the same way I do, but you're interested in spiritual things. So let's talk about it. And then he goes in and he raises questions about where they are coming from. You think an idol, something carved by hand, can explain what's going on in the creation? You think a building can hold the God who's created the world? Those kinds of questions. He's trying to give them pause from their perspective about the way they see the world, and then opening up the possibility there may be another way to see the world.
Yeah. I mean, he has the willingness to, the humility to, the ability to understand their culture before he brings his own into the
exactly right
picture.
And so he communicates enough of a bridge about understanding where they're coming from that then he can engage, because that's part of what he's doing. He's not saying he agrees. See, it's one that you have to distinguish between, I can understand where someone is coming from without agreeing that they ought to come from that place.
Sure.
So I have to distinguish between understanding and assessment. But what we sometimes do is we move to assessment without making an effort to understand. And then we make mistakes.
And Paul seemed to have an ability that seems different than right now too, where it seemed like he rarely was making himself an enemy of the, like just a few chapters later in Acts when he's we're talking about Artemis and they drag him before the Roman official, and then there's really nothing he can charge him with, and he hasn't even said anything bad of Artemis. I mean, he essentially says, you're the ones that are in trouble here if you don't disband.
Yeah.
I just always thought it was amazing that Paul engaged. He could speak to truth and what was false, but in the whole time he never seemed to say things that made him an enemy, like that tore down
was more
the culture. He was
on presenting the positives of the relationship that he had
Sure.
with God. And even though he could challenge, he challenges in Acts in Mars Hill about the how can I say this, the small size of idolatry. It isn't big enough to encompass what's going on in the world. He challenges idolatry in that way, but he's more focused on presenting the opportunity of what it means to be rightly connected to God.
Sure. Yeah, and does it in a way without without really saying a bad thing about. He challenges it. He points out why this is true and this is false, but he doesn't, I don't know, take cheap shots at
No, generally speaking, he's
Artemis
not
or
taking
whatever
cheap
it is.
shots. Or he only begins to go there when he gets exasperated with where someone is. So I'm
Sure.
thinking of the woman who he rebukes the devil in an exercises, who's been following him, saying, you know, this one is preaching in the name of the Most High God. It was only after a long time of her doing that that eventually got on his nerves and he said something about it.
Yeah.
There is a time to challenge and respond in kind of a direct confrontal kind of way. Don't want to remove that possibility, but you work to get there. You don't start there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, just thinking about our, I don't know, the loss of the ability lately to, to talk to people, to hold different perspectives. I think you probably summed it up already. I mean, is there any more than just literally, we just need to listen to people in terms of the keys to being
Need to
able
listen
to
and learn how to
engage,
ask good questions.
ask
And
good questions.
here's another thing that happens when you have conversations like that.
Yeah.
When you make the effort to really try and understand where someone else is coming from, when it becomes your turn, you've opened the door for them doing the same for you. And then you get to share.
Yeah. Well, that's probably, that would be a big key right there. I think, again, we seem to not be able to figure out what the right questions to ask or even have the willingness to ask.
But
lately.
the whole point I'm making is there's a tone that you're setting in the way you're engaging with the person, which is establishing the basis of your interaction with them.
Yeah.
And there's going to come a time where you do that enough. Hopefully it will be reciprocated.
Sure.
And when it's reciprocated, you've established the basis of establishing a listening and engaging environment for that conversation to take place in.
Yeah. I don't know. I've always thought there was truth to this. I heard someone explain, healthy conversation before as play, as, as children play, where play is only fun when there's give and take on both sides. As soon as one person is no longer playing, then it's a fight, it's dominating, it's no longer fun, edifying, enjoyable, helpful. It's just a battle, which seems to be our conversations lately. There's not a lot of give and take, like as you're saying, like you show me this tone and I will show you this tone.
So you walk into a controversial space. You walk into a controversial space, and there are really two ways to approach it. I can approach it as a debater. I can approach it as a listener. Okay. The debater, and it's easy to tell what mode you're in. Because if you're a debater, while the person is saying what they're saying to you, you're forming your rebuttal.
Sure.
This is how I'm going to come back at them. So I'm going to challenge them. If you're a listener, you're formulating questions to find out more about what they're saying and why. And your initial mode in these conversations is going to be a listener, to find out the motivations and why, et cetera.
Yeah.
And not attribute motive, but let them speak for themselves. You're trying to understand what they're coming for, what they believe and why. They're what I call their whys and wherefores.
Yeah.
And if you can understand their whys and wherefores, you put yourself in a better position to know how to approach them when you want to share your content, when you move from understanding to assessment. And you're going to share what some of that assessment is from your point of view. And you're trying to engage them, perhaps with categories that they currently don't have and that kind of thing. And you've laid the groundwork for understanding how they're seeing the world and what their template is for that understanding. When you work hard to go there, you actually put yourself in a better position to share with them substantively. And you've built the right tonal background for that sharing.
Sure.
Because you've respected them in their story.
Yeah. Did you, again, just seen shifts over time in your lifetime? Have you seen a change?
We used to be able to do that. We don't do it in our public discourse now very much. Everything's polarized. It's immediately labeled as all good or all bad. There's no common ground to seek. There's no basis for thinking about how to engage and maybe even see if there's common space to be found. We just assume that it's all good or all bad. Everything's a polarity. It's either or. And sometimes we need, So life to me is about what I call calibration. I think that most of our debates in the public square, not all of them, but many of them, the majority of them, are actually a case of living in a dysfunctional world where values are colliding. Okay, they're bumping up against each other. Each side has a point to bring to the conversation that needs attention. Well, when you polarize that conversation, you say, this is the value that counts, and this doesn't mean anything, or you minimize it, okay? You never have the discussion you need to have, which is, how do we bring these two sets of values, each of which has merit, in better relationship to each other? You never have that conversation. And so you create a public space that is nothing but confrontation, when sometimes what you need is a public space that is about calibration.
Sure. Well, as you say, like bringing those two together, I feel like nobody's thinking about bringing those two together anymore. They're just thinking about, well, I just want to win. Like I want mine to take
I'm
the full
right.
space.
I'm
I want to
right,
win.
and I deserve to win. The
Yeah.
other side is wrong, and they're completely wrong.
Yeah.
And I can't trust anything that they raise or bring up or say,
Yep.
because it's coming from a wrong space. We make everything a major worldview clash.
Yeah.
And in the process of making it a major worldview clash, we remove the need for conversation.
Sure. Well, when I look at politics, and Canada is no different, but you know, because the US is mainly the news we watch even here in Canada, it feels like you know, if you pick one party or the other party, if the other, you know, if the party gets in that you're not for, the world is going to fall apart. Like it feels very fatalistic, like that will be the end of society, or that will be the end of society. So then there's definitely no working together, because
exactly, there's no. So what's changed is 40, 50 years ago, you would see, at least in the United States, the people of the various political parties try and hammer out some type of mutual understanding for how to deal with the space in which they differ.
Okay.
Okay, that isn't happening anymore. What's happening is each side is going after the other as if they're all wrong.
Yeah. And as if those wrongs, that's going to end our.
Yeah. Well, the more dire you can make it, the better. I mean, I'm thinking of a joke earlier. It goes something: we've had so many apocalypses, the world should have been destroyed 1,000 times over.
Yeah, I mean, it's fear mongering to some degree, right? I mean, you could probably gain a stronger following,
and everybody does it. Everybody does. The other thing we do is we debate by label. We don't debate by substance.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, I call it the exorcism. Okay, I label you, I bury you, then I don't have to deal with you.
Yeah.
All our political commercials are built on that premise.
Yeah, that's well said.
They're teaching us how not to engage.
Yeah. With at the very most maybe sound bites.
Yeah, well, it's dismissive. I label you, I dismiss you, I don't have to pay attention to anything that you say.
No, that's a good point. Well, I only have a few minutes left. I don't want to take you over the hour, Dr. Bock. Just I'll ask you two more questions if I can. This one's probably a little unrelated, but maybe in the same sphere. Do you think there is a divide between the secular and the sacred? Or I just, you know, should Christians live lives
yes and
that?
No. Okay. The answer is yes and no. There is a kind of divide between the secular and the sacred, in that certain space is defined in secular ways that we have to recognize. So here's what I mean. I'm going to use the US as an illustration. I think this would work in Canada too. In political systems where there is freedom of religion, okay, and there are actually two models for this in the West. One is a strict secular sacred divide. The religious doesn't belong in public space in any way, shape, or form. That's actually the French model. It's built on a pure Enlightenment basis. But the United States was a compromise between Enlightenment values and Judeo-Christian values. And so the way it works is you can bring your religious convictions into public space, but the public space will not sanction or support your particular religious conviction. Okay? That's what this means. When you walk into public space, whether you are agnostic, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Baptist, a Unitarian, your religion means nothing. You all have the same rights. Okay, that's a secularized space. Okay, but the reason I say yes and no is because the point I made very early on, we're all accountable to God for the decisions that we make, whether we recognize it or not. So you can create a secular space, but in the end, at least for a person who's a believer, no space is secular.
Sure.
Okay. It's all subject to the oversight and interaction with God, but at an individual level, and then by how we form the societies that we form.
Yeah.
Some people are aware of that and some people aren't. This is the incognito part of the spiritual battle. And so we need to engage. We need to try to persuade people about what's best for society. But if we lose, we need to lose well.
That's well said. Lose well. What would you say in the Christian life is the, I don't know, what are the keys to living a life that doesn't make that divide? You know, where my work, my play, my Sundays.
I live out my Christian convictions with as much consistency as I can.
Amen. Well, this will be my last question, and this is probably for my interest more than anyone listening. Can I ask what your, well, first, maybe what you're reading now, and then two, if you have any book recommendations for the church?
Well, I mean, I'm reading all kinds of stuff. I'm just finished. I'm getting ready for a class on Paul and Jesus and how the New Testament holds together. So I'm reading two books. One is called Paul, Follower of Christ or Founder of Christianity by David Wenham. And the other is a book about who created Christianity. It's a collection of essays, but it's all on the Paul Jesus problem. The other stuff that I've been reading has been related to the development of the Gospels, particularly in the period before the Gospels was written. What's the interaction between memory, eyewitnesses, tradition, and the gap that exists between the event of Jesus and the writing of the gospel? And there are a couple of books that I've been reading that deal with what are called memory, the role of memory in the formation of the tradition, and how memory works and how that impacts tradition, both individual and social memory. That is the memory of an individual and the memory of a group.
Okay.
And what that has to do with theological formation. So that's
any particular book there?
Both technical reading. Sorry.
Any particular book there that you can remember the name of?
A couple books. One is they're very technical. One is called Matthew and Q.
Okay.
And the other one's a book that's not out yet. I just wrote a recommendation for it called Resurrection Remembered.
Okay. And would you have any recommendations for the average Western Christian? Books, lately that
obviously the book I did on cultural intelligence is a book that I would commend to people for. It's 150 pages. You can read it in probably 4 hours.
I've been especially circulating. You put an article out a while ago that was chapter 1 that has been going around our church. So now that people have kind of tasted that, we're going to order some copies and pass those around. But
okay, well, great.
That's been a big.
That's certainly worth it. There's a classic work called Christ and Culture that talks about the various ways in which one can order Christ and culture.
It's
over 50 years old. It's the kind of the initial way that people talk about this kind of a space. There's a book by Christopher Watkins on critical theory in general that just came out last year. That's very good, because he is one of these people who says it's not a matter of a polarity where one side has it all right and the other side has it all wrong. We got to learn how to sort out the shared space, and the conversations need to take place in that shared space.
Diagonalization, I think, right?
Yeah.
I've benefited hugely from that book, and actually got to talk to Dr. Watkins just before Christmas, kind of. And Niebuhr, and I always think Newbegin too have been very beneficial.
Yeah, if you want anything having to do with thinking about being a Christian in a primarily non-Christian culture, Newbegin's great. He was a missionary to India for years.
Right. Okay.
And so he understood what it was to live as a Christian in a predominantly non-Christian environment.
Well, I appreciate the recommendations, and again, thank you for your time, Dr. Bock. It was great.
My pleasure. Glad to be able to do it.